Clean that hand before you offer it. The words didn't come from anger, not even from disgust, just a quiet, casual correction, like someone pointing out a stain on glass, and Richard Whitmore didn't even look at her face when he said it, just glanced briefly at Naomi Carter's outstretched hand, and then at his own, reaching for a monogrammed linen cloth from a passing server, wiping his palms slowly, deliberately, as if time itself had stretched to watch the gesture unfold, and for a second, the entire ballroom seemed to inhale and forget how to breathe, the soft hum of a string quartet dissolving into a thin, distant echo, ice settling in crystal glasses with faint clicks that sounded louder than they should, heels pausing mid-step against polished marble that reflected the overhead chandeliers like frozen stars, and Naomi's hand remained there, suspended in that narrow space between expectation and rejection, fingers steady, palm open, not trembling, not retreating, just existing in a silence that pressed gently against her skin, her badge catching a sliver of light as it shifted slightly against her black blazer, the simple uniform marking her as part of the background in a room designed for people who were never meant to be ignored. And yet here she was, centered without trying, noticed without invitation, her eyes lifting just enough to meet the space where his gaze had been but no longer was. And then, slowly, she lowered her hand, not with embarrassment, not with hesitation, but with a kind of quiet control that didn't ask permission, didn't demand acknowledgement, just reclaimed the moment without breaking it. While around her, conversations attempted to restart in fragments, voices lowered, careful, like guests unsure whether they had just witnessed something insignificant or something they would remember long after the night ended. A woman in a silver gown adjusting her bracelet, as if nothing had happened. A man near the bar clearing his throat and laughing too quickly, the sound thin and misplaced. And through it all, Richard Whitmore continued forward, already speaking to someone else, already moving past the moment as if it had never belonged to him in the first place. His security detail shifting with him in a practiced formation, dark suits, subtle earpieces, eyes scanning without expression, but one of them, just one, hesitated half a step longer than the others, his gaze flickering back toward Naomi for the briefest second before snapping forward again, as if something in his training had been interrupted by recognition he couldn't yet place. And Naomi noticed, not because she was looking for it, but because she had learned to notice everything, the small pauses, the quiet misalignments, the way rooms revealed themselves not in what people said, but in what they almost did, and she adjusted the cuff of her sleeve, smoothing it with a precise motion, her posture unchanged, her breathing even, as she turned slightly toward the nearest table, aligning a place setting that had been left just a fraction off center, the fork too close to the plate, the napkin folded at the wrong angle, details no one else would see but everyone would feel, and as she moved, the light followed her briefly across the polished floor, catching in the reflection of her shoes, tracing the outline of someone who had just been dismissed and yet remained entirely unshaken, the air around her settling again, not quite the same as before, not warmer, not colder, just altered in a way that no one could name, as if the room itself had registered something it wasn't ready to understand. And somewhere behind her, a security radio clicked softly, a whisper of static breaking through the silence like the first crack in glass. Naomi moved through the room like she had always belonged there, not in the way the guests belonged with their tailored suits and polished laughter, but in the way something essential belongs, quiet and necessary, her hands adjusting, aligning, correcting the invisible details that kept everything from slipping out of place. A glass rotated just enough so the logo faced outward, a chair nudged half an inch closer to symmetry, movements so subtle they dissolved into the rhythm of the evening. And yet the atmosphere around her did not fully return to what it had been. There was a thin tension left behind, like a thread pulled too tight beneath silk, and across the ballroom Richard Whitmore continued speaking, his voice smooth, practiced, carrying the weight of someone used to being heard without interruption, though now there was a slight delay between his words and the reactions they earned, as if the room needed an extra second to decide how to respond. And near the far column one of the security officers shifted his stance again, his hand rising briefly toward his earpiece before stopping halfway, fingers hovering as if waiting for confirmation that had not yet come, his eyes flicking once more toward Naomi, longer this time, studying her posture, her movements, the calm precision that did not match the profile of someone temporary or unseen, and Naomi felt it without turning, the awareness settling at the edge of her senses. Familiar, measured, not threatening, just present, and she reached for a tray left unattended on a side table, lifting it with steady hands, redistributing the weight so the glasses did not clink, the faint scent of citrus and polished wood lingering in the air as she moved past a group of guests who lowered their voices as she approached, not out of respect, but out of habit, the quiet that follows someone you are not supposed to notice. And yet one of them paused mid-sentence, watching her for a fraction too long, as if trying to place something just out of reach. And near the entrance another guard straightened, his shoulders tightening, his gaze narrowing slightly as his earpiece gave a soft, almost inaudible pulse, a coded signal that passed through the security network like a ripple under still water. And for a moment nothing outward changed, no alarms, no raised voices, just the subtle synchronization of trained bodies adjusting in unison, feet repositioning, lines of sight recalibrating, attention shifting not toward the center of power, but toward the edges, toward her. And Naomi set the tray down gently on a passing stand, her fingers releasing it without sound, her breathing even, her expression unchanged, as she stepped into a pocket of light near the window where the city stretched out beyond the glass. Miles of quiet streets and distant traffic glowing under the night sky. And behind her, one of the guards finally touched his earpiece, his voice low, controlled, barely a whisper, confirm identity. And the response came not as words, but as silence, the kind that meant something had already been found. And his posture shifted almost imperceptibly, not relaxing, not tightening, but realigning, as if a new set of instructions had replaced the old. And across the room Richard laughed at something someone said, the sound confident, unbroken, unaware that the axis of attention had begun to tilt, slowly, quietly, away from him, and Naomi adjusted the cuff of her sleeve once more, a small, precise motion, her reflection faint in the glass, steady and composed, as the room around her continued to move, unaware that it had already begun to change. The glass reflected more than the city. It reflected movement, subtle shifts that did not belong to the rhythm of a social event. Naomi noticed it first in the timing, the way conversations no longer overlapped naturally, the way laughter rose a fraction too late and faded a fraction too quickly, as if the room itself had started listening for something else, something beneath the surface. And behind her one of the security officers took a step that did not match his assigned position, just half a foot to the left, enough to widen his line of sight toward her without turning his head, and another across the room mirrored the adjustment, not coordinated in appearance, but aligned in intent, their eyes never settling fully, always returning, recalculating. And Naomi remained still for a moment, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, fingertips grazing the smooth linen, grounding herself in something physical, something neutral, while her mind traced the pattern, unfolding around her, not with urgency, not with fear, but with quiet recognition, the kind that comes from experience rather than surprise. And a server passed by carrying a tray of sparkling water, the bubbles catching the light in brief flashes, and Naomi stepped forward to steady one of the glasses before it tipped, her movement precise, almost invisible, and the server nodded in thanks without truly seeing her. Already moving on, while across the ballroom Richard Whitmore shifted his stance slightly, his attention momentarily drawn by the change in his security formation, not enough to concern him, just enough to register as something different, his eyes scanning the room with the confidence of someone who expects order to follow him wherever he goes. And for a second his gaze brushed past Naomi again, this time lingering just long enough to notice that she had not left, that she had not shrunk into the background the way he had assumed she would. And there was a flicker. There, not recognition, not yet, just a faint irritation at something unresolved, something that did not fit neatly into his understanding of the room. And then it passed, replaced by the next conversation, the next handshake, the next performance of power, while near the entrance a quiet exchange unfolded between two guards, one leaning slightly toward the other, his voice barely audible. She is still on the floor, and the response came in a measured tone. Do not engage. followed by a pause that stretched just a second too long, as if waiting for a correction that never came, and Naomi felt the shift deepen, not louder, not more visible, but more certain, like a current strengthening beneath. Still water, and she moved again, not away, not toward, just along the edge of the room, her steps soft against the marble, her reflection gliding beside her in the glass, steady and unbroken. And as she passed a mirrored column, one of the guards finally turned his head fully, his eyes meeting her reflection instead of her directly, a safer distance, a controlled acknowledgement. And in that brief intersection something settled into place, not spoken, not confirmed, but understood, and his posture changed, shoulders aligning, stance adjusting, no longer guarding the man at the center of the room, but recalibrating around something else entirely. And Naomi paused for just a breath, her gaze lifting slightly, not to meet his, but to register the shift, the quiet transfer of attention that had begun without announcement. And in the distance the city lights flickered against the night sky, steady and indifferent, while inside, the balance of the room continued to tilt, slow enough to go unnoticed, certain enough that it could not be undone. The shift did not announce itself, it settled, quiet and precise, like a weight placed carefully on a scale, and Naomi felt it most in the way space began to open around her, not intentionally, not dramatically, just a subtle widening as guests adjusted their positions without knowing why, creating a small, invisible perimeter that followed her movements along the edge of the room, and the security team, once orbiting tightly around Richard Whitmore, began to redistribute in ways that only trained eyes would notice, their formation loosening at the center and tightening at the margins, their attention no longer anchored to a single point but scanning, recalibrating, aligning towards something that had not been acknowledged out loud. And Naomi continued her work, adjusting a floral arrangement that had tilted slightly off balance, her fingers brushing against cool glass, steadying it with a gentle correction, the scent of fresh lilies rising faintly as she stepped back to assess, her expression unchanged, her breathing even, while behind her a guard's voice came through the earpiece again, softer now, more controlled. "We have a positive match." And the reply did not come immediately, just a brief pause filled with static, the kind of silence that carried weight, that signaled confirmation without needing words. And across the ballroom Richard paused mid-sentence, not because he heard the transmission, but because something in the room had shifted enough for him to feel it, the reactions around him just slightly off-tempo, the attention of his own security detail no longer as tightly fixed on him as it should have been, and his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, scanning the room again, this time with a sharper focus, searching for the source of the imbalance. And they found her, standing near the window, framed by the city lights beyond the glass, her silhouette calm, composed, entirely unaffected by the undercurrent moving through the room. And for a second he hesitated, not understanding why she was still there, why she had not faded into the background as expected, why the room itself seemed to be quietly rearranging around her presence. And a faint crease formed between his brows, not anger, not yet, just confusion edged with irritation. While near the entrance one of the guards took a deliberate step forward, breaking from the original formation, his posture straightening, his focus locking fully onto Naomi now, no longer peripheral, no longer uncertain. And another followed, not closing in, not confronting, just repositioning, creating lines of sight that intersected around her rather than around Richard. And Naomi noticed the change fully now, not just as a pattern, but as a completed shift, the kind that moves from possibility into certainty. And she turned slightly, just enough to face the room more directly, her hands resting calmly at her sides, her gaze level, meeting no one in particular yet seeing everything. And in that moment the distance between her and the center of power did not feel as wide as it had minutes before, not because she had moved closer, but because the room itself had begun to tilt in her direction, and somewhere behind her the faint click of a security radio sounded again, followed by a single, clear instruction, "Hold position." And the words carried a different weight now, no longer about maintaining order around a billionaire, but about preserving a moment that had not yet fully revealed itself. And Naomi adjusted her sleeve once more, a small, precise motion, as if aligning herself with the shift that had already taken place, her reflection steady in the glass, her presence quiet but undeniable. While the room continued to breathe around her, slower now, more careful, as if waiting for something it could not yet see but had already begun to recognize. The air in the room did not break, it tightened, like something invisible had been drawn just a little closer around everyone present, and Naomi felt it in the stillness between movements. The way even the smallest gestures now carried weight, a glass set down more carefully, a step placed more deliberately, as if the entire ballroom had begun to move with quiet awareness instead of effortless ease, and she stood near the window, the cool surface of the glass just inches from her shoulder, the faint hum of the city beyond filtering through like a distant reminder that the world outside continued without pause, while inside everything had slowed to a near standstill. And across the room Richard Whitmore finally stopped speaking altogether, not abruptly, not in a way that drew attention, but with a gradual fading of his voice, his sentence trailing off as his focus shifted fully now, his eyes narrowing slightly as he watched the subtle repositioning of his security team, the way their formation no longer centered on him but adjusted around something else, someone else, and for the first time that evening his posture changed, just a fraction, a slight straightening of his shoulders, a recalibration of presence that came from instinct rather than intention, as if his body recognized a shift his mind had not yet processed, and one of the guards stepped forward into clearer view, not approaching Naomi directly, not breaking protocol in any obvious way, but standing where he could be seen by both her and Richard, his stance firm, composed, his hand no longer hovering near his earpiece but resting at his side, ready, and his voice, when it came, was low but clear enough to carry through the thinning noise of the room. "Sir, we need a moment." And the words did not sound like a request. They sounded like a transition, and Richard's gaze flicked toward him, irritation flashing briefly before settling into something more measured, more cautious, because even he could sense now that this was not routine, that something had shifted beyond his control, and the guard's eyes moved past him then, not in defiance, not in dismissal, but in acknowledgement of a different priority, landing on Naomi with a focus that was no longer uncertain, no longer searching, but confirmed, and Naomi met the moment without moving, her expression calm, her posture steady, her hands relaxed at her sides, as if she had been standing in that exact place for far longer than the last few minutes, as if she had been waiting for the room to catch up to something she already understood, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, dense with realization that had not yet been spoken, and one by one, the surrounding guests began to notice, not the reason, not the truth, but the shift itself. The way attention had moved, the way the center of gravity in the room had quietly relocated, and a murmur started at the edges, low, uncertain, like the first ripple before a wave, while Naomi adjusted her sleeve one final time, the fabric smoothing beneath her fingers, her reflection steady in the glass beside her, and in that reflection the room looked different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because the balance had been rewritten, and when the guard took a single step closer, stopping at a respectful distance, his voice softer now, almost formal, "Ma'am." The word landed with a clarity that cut through everything else, not loud, not forceful, but unmistakable, and in that moment, without explanation, without announcement, the room understood that whatever had just begun, it was no longer about a billionaire. The word did not echo, but it settled into the room with a weight that could not be ignored, and Naomi turned her head just slightly, not in surprise, not in reaction, but in acknowledgement, her gaze meeting the guards for a brief, measured second before shifting past him, taking in the wider room that had now fully stilled, conversations abandoned mid-sentence, glasses held halfway to lips, eyes drawn not by spectacle but by the quiet certainty that something important was unfolding, and the guard straightened further, his posture no longer that of someone protecting a perimeter, but of someone recognizing authority, his voice lowering again, more precise now. "We have confirmation," and though the words were not directed at anyone in particular, they carried across the silence, reaching Richard Whitmore with unmistakable clarity, and Richard's expression tightened, the faint irritation from moments before replaced by something sharper, something edged with calculation, his eyes moving between the guard and Naomi, trying to reconcile the shift, trying to understand how the center of control had slipped without warning. And he took a step forward, slow, deliberate, his presence still commanding but no longer unquestioned. "What is this?" he asked, his tone even but carrying an undercurrent that demanded an answer, and the guard did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of protocol, his attention remaining on Naomi as if awaiting a cue that had not yet been given. And Naomi did not rush to fill the silence. She simply stood there, composed, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady, allowing the moment to expand on its own, allowing the weight of it to settle where it needed to. And around them the room seemed to hold itself in place, the faint hum of the air conditioning the only sound that continued uninterrupted. And then, with a small, almost imperceptible movement, Naomi stepped forward, not toward Richard, not toward the guard, but into the open space that had formed between them, her shoes making no sound against the marble, her reflection moving with her in the glass, steady and aligned. And the guard shifted slightly to the side, not stepping back, not yielding in the traditional sense, but making space in a way that acknowledged her position without announcement. And Naomi's voice, when it came, was calm, even, carrying just enough to be heard without forcing itself into the room. "You can stand down," she said, and the simplicity of the words contrasted sharply with their effect, because the guard did not question them, did not hesitate. He simply nodded once, a precise, controlled motion, and the subtle tension in his stance eased, not disappearing, but redirecting, as if a new set of instructions had just replaced the old. And that single exchange, quiet as it was, shifted something fundamental in the room, because it confirmed what had only been implied until now, that the authority present did not belong solely to the man everyone had been watching. And Richard saw it, not in the words, but in the response, in the way his own security adjusted without looking to him, in the way the room itself seemed to reorient around a presence he had dismissed just minutes earlier. And for the first time that evening, he did not speak immediately, his silence stretching just long enough to reveal that he was no longer entirely certain of his position, while Naomi remained where she was, composed, unhurried, her gaze steady, not confrontational, not yielding, simply present. And in that presence there was no need to raise her voice, no need to assert anything further, because the shift had already happened, and everyone in the room could feel it. Richard Whitmore did not like silence when it was not his to control, and this silence had weight, the kind that pressed against the chest and made even confident men measure their next words more carefully. And he shifted his stance again, not stepping back, but no longer advancing, his eyes fixed on Naomi now with a sharper focus, searching for something he could define, something he could reduce to a category he understood: staff, mistake, interruption, anything that would restore the balance he was used to. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that effort, smooth but tighter at the edges. "I do not recall inviting you into this part of the evening." And the words landed with a faint echo of authority, a reminder of who he believed himself to be in that room. And a few of the guests near him nodded subtly, as if anchoring themselves to the version of reality that had existed before. But the reaction did not spread. It stopped where it started, contained, unable to reclaim the room the way it normally would. And Naomi did not respond immediately. She let the words settle, let them exist without rushing to answer, her gaze steady, not challenging, not submissive, simply present. And she took a small step to the side, just enough to align herself more directly with him, the movement quiet, controlled, her shoes making no sound against the marble. And in that adjustment there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a subtle repositioning that made it clear. She was no longer moving around the room, she was standing within it. And one of the guards behind Richard shifted again, his attention flicking between them, no longer anticipating a command from his employer, but waiting, as if the next instruction would come from somewhere else entirely. And Naomi's voice, when it came, was calm, measured, carrying just enough to reach him without drawing attention from the edges of the room. "You invited everyone who matters tonight," she said. And there was no accusation in the tone, no emphasis, just a simple statement that landed with quiet precision. And for a brief second Richard's expression changed, not dramatically, just a slight tightening around the eyes, a flicker of recognition that something in that sentence did not align with the control he thought he held. and he opened his mouth to respond, then paused, just for a fraction of a second, as if the timing of the room no longer matched his own, and around them the guests watched more openly now, no longer pretending not to notice, their attention drawn by the subtle shift in power they could feel but not yet explain. And near the entrance one of the guards lowered his hand from his earpiece completely, his posture settling into something more formal, more deliberate, as if the situation had moved beyond routine security into something that required a different kind of presence. And Naomi remained steady, her hands relaxed at her sides, her shoulders even, her breathing unbroken. And she held his gaze now, not in defiance, not in challenge, but in clarity, the kind that does not need to be raised or sharpened to be understood. And in that clarity there was no rush, no need to push the moment forward, because the shift that had begun earlier had now fully arrived, and everyone in the room could feel it, even if they could not yet name it. The quiet realization that the woman he had dismissed had not only remained, she had become the point around which everything else was now turning. The sentence lingered in the air longer than it should have, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it did not belong to the version of the evening everyone had walked into, and Richard felt it, the subtle dissonance between what he expected and what was unfolding, his fingers tightening slightly at his side before relaxing again, a controlled adjustment that betrayed nothing to those who did not know how to look, and he let out a small breath through his nose, the kind meant to reset a moment, to re-establish rhythm. That is a bold assumption, he replied, his tone even, measured, carefully neutral, but the words did not land with the same authority they might have 10 minutes earlier. They settled instead, lighter, less anchored, as if the room itself had stopped carrying them forward. And Naomi did not react to the tone, did not shift or step back. She simply held her position, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, allowing his words to pass without resistance, without acceptance, just letting them exist on their own. And that absence of reaction created its own kind of pressure, a quiet space where his authority had nothing to push against, nothing to define itself through, and around them the guests had stopped pretending entirely now, their conversations abandoned, their attention drawn fully into the moment, some watching openly, others trying to appear casual while their eyes returned again and again, unable to look away from the subtle unraveling of something they had assumed was fixed. And near the back of the room one of the guards took a step forward, not toward Richard, but toward Naomi's line of sight, positioning himself where he could observe both without obstruction, his expression composed, his movements deliberate, and another adjusted his stance near the entrance, closing a gap that had not existed before, their coordination quiet, almost invisible, but unmistakably intentional. And Naomi noticed it all without turning her head, her awareness moving through the room like a current, registering each shift, each alignment. And for a brief moment her eyes flicked toward the nearest guard, not to seek confirmation, but to acknowledge it, a silent exchange that lasted less than a second but carried clarity, and the guard responded in kind, a slight inclination of his head, subtle enough that no one else would register it, but precise enough to confirm what had already been set in motion, and Richard saw that too. Not the meaning, not the full picture, but enough to recognize that something had slipped beyond his reach, his gaze narrowing again, his attention sharpening, and he took another step forward, closing the distance by just a few inches, not enough to confront, but enough to reassert presence. "You seem very certain of yourself," he said, the words chosen carefully, probing rather than declaring, and Naomi's expression remained calm, her breathing steady, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same quiet certainty as before. "Certainty is not the same as assumption," she said, and the distinction settled into the space between them, precise and controlled, and for a second the room felt smaller, the distance between them more defined, not by physical space, but by something less visible, less tangible, the shift of understanding that had begun to take shape. And in the reflection of the glass beside her, Naomi could see the room behind her, the guests, the guards, the subtle repositioning of attention, all of it aligning in a way that no longer centered on the man who had once commanded it effortlessly, and she adjusted her stance just slightly, grounding herself in that moment, not claiming it, not forcing it, simply standing within it as it unfolded, while the room held its breath, waiting for the next piece of truth to reveal itself. The room did not move forward. It hovered, suspended in that fragile space between realization and denial. And Naomi could feel the shift settling deeper now. No longer a question, no longer a possibility, but something solid, something irreversible. And she let the silence stretch just a moment longer, not to create tension, but to allow it to become visible, to let everyone present feel what had already changed before a single word confirmed it. And across from her, Richard Whitmore held her gaze, his expression controlled, but no longer effortless, the edges of his confidence now sharpened by something unfamiliar, something he could not immediately categorize. And for a man who had built his world on certainty, that small gap in understanding carried weight, and his eyes flicked briefly toward his security detail again, expecting alignment, expecting reinforcement. But what he saw instead was discipline without deference, presence without submission, and it registered, not fully, but enough to disrupt the rhythm he relied on. And Naomi saw that moment, the exact second where assumption met resistance, and she stepped forward just slightly, closing the distance not in confrontation, but in clarity, her movement slow, deliberate, her posture unchanged, her voice calm when it came. "You built this room to reflect control," she said, the words quiet but precise, landing with a weight that did not need volume, and a faint ripple passed through the guests, not a reaction, but a recognition, the kind that travels silently through a crowd when something true is spoken aloud. And Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his gaze narrowing as he listened, not interrupting, not dismissing, because something in the tone demanded attention in a way he had not expected. And Naomi continued, her voice steady. "But control depends on who is allowed to be seen." And that sentence settled differently, not just between them, but across the room, touching something deeper, something that shifted how the moment was being understood. And near the entrance, one of the guards adjusted his stance again, not reacting to the words themselves, but to the direction they were pointing, his posture aligning more formally now, his attention fully anchored, no longer scanning for disruption, but holding space for what was unfolding. And Richard inhaled slowly, a measured breath, as if preparing to respond, to reclaim the narrative. But the timing was no longer his. The room no longer moved at his pace. And for the first time since the evening began, there was a hesitation, small, controlled, but unmistakable. And Naomi did not press further. She did not need to. She simply let the moment rest where it was, her presence steady, her gaze unwavering. And in the reflection of the glass behind her, the entire room seemed to shift again, not physically, but in perception, the lines of power, redrawn without announcement, without force, just through the quiet accumulation of truth. And somewhere in the background a glass was set down a little too carefully, the faint sound marking the passage of a moment that could not be undone. And Naomi adjusted her stance once more, grounding herself in that new balance, not claiming it, not announcing it, just standing within it as it became undeniable, while the room held its breath, no longer waiting to see if something would happen, but beginning to understand that it already had. Richard Whitmore finally moved, not forward, not back, but sideways, a subtle shift that placed him just outside the exact center of the room he had controlled all evening. And that single adjustment, small as it was, carried more meaning than any words he could have spoken, because it acknowledged something he had not yet admitted, that the ground beneath him was no longer fixed. And he exhaled slowly, his gaze steady on Naomi now, no longer dismissive, no longer irritated, but searching, measuring, as if recalculating the space between them with a precision he had never needed before. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter, not weaker, but more deliberate. "Then help me understand what I am seeing," he said. And the question did not carry the same authority as his earlier words. It carried something else, something closer to caution. And around them the room responded to that shift, the tension easing just slightly, not disappearing, but transforming, as if the moment had crossed from confrontation into something more defined, something that required attention rather than reaction. And Naomi did not answer immediately. She let the question exist, let it settle into the silence that had become familiar, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged. And then she reached into the inner pocket of her blazer with a movement so calm it did not draw attention at first, just a simple gesture, controlled, intentional, and when her hand emerged, it held a small, flat object, no larger than a standard identification card, its surface catching the light briefly before she turned it toward him, not extending it fully, not offering it for inspection, just allowing it to be seen, and the nearest guard reacted first, not with alarm, not with urgency, but with recognition, his posture aligning instantly, his attention sharpening into something precise, formal, and the other guards followed in subtle sequence, their stance shifting into a formation that no longer resembled event security, but something more structured, more official, and Richard's eyes moved from Naomi's face to the card and back again, the faintest crease forming between his brows as the pieces began to align, not fully, not yet, but enough to create a new understanding of the moment he was standing in. And Naomi spoke then, her voice calm, even, carrying just enough to reach him without disturbing the fragile balance of the room. "You are seeing what happens when visibility changes," she said, and the words did not explain everything, but they clarified enough, and she lowered the card slightly, not hiding it, just returning it to a position where it no longer needed to be the focus, because the shift it represented had already taken hold, and across the room a guest took a slow step back, not out of fear, but out of instinct, as if recognizing that the space no longer belonged to observation alone, and Richard remained still, his expression controlled, but no longer certain, his understanding catching up in fragments, each one altering the way he saw the room, the people, the moment itself, and for the first time that evening, he did not attempt to regain control, he simply stood there, present, aware, as the structure he had relied on quietly rearranged itself around a truth he had not been prepared to face, while Naomi remained composed, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged, and in the reflection of the glass behind her, the room no longer looked the same, not because anything had moved, but because everything had been seen differently. The recognition did not arrive all at once. It unfolded in layers, subtle and precise, and Richard Whitmore felt it in the way the room no longer responded to him as it had before, the slight delay in eye contact, the hesitation in movement, the absence of immediate alignment that he had once taken for granted, and his gaze returned to the card in Naomi's hand, not because he needed to see it again, but because his mind was still catching up to what it represented, the quiet authority that had been present from the moment she entered the room, unseen only because no one had chosen to see it, and he drew in a slow breath, steadying himself, not out of fear, but out of recalibration, the kind that comes when certainty gives way to something more complex. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more measured, stripped of the casual dominance it had carried earlier. "You could have made this clear from the start," he said, and the statement was not an accusation, not entirely, but it carried the weight of a man who realized he had misjudged a situation in a way he was not accustomed to. And Naomi listened without interruption, her expression calm, her posture unchanged, allowing the words to settle before she responded, and when she did, her voice remained steady, even, carrying a clarity that did not need emphasis. "I did," she said, and the simplicity of the reply landed with quiet force, not because it was loud, but because it reframed everything that had come before. And for a moment, Richard did not respond, his eyes holding hers as the implication settled in, the handshake he had refused, the presence he had dismissed, the moment he had chosen not to recognize, and around them the room seemed to shift again, not in movement, but in understanding, the guests now watching with a different awareness, no longer witnessing an exchange of status, but the unraveling of an assumption they had all participated in. And one of the guards stepped slightly to the side, his stance formal, his attention no longer divided, as if the situation had moved beyond ambiguity into something defined, and Naomi lowered her hand fully now, the card returning to her pocket with the same quiet precision with which it had appeared, its purpose fulfilled without spectacle, and she met Richard's gaze once more, not with challenge, not with triumph, but with a kind of steady presence that did not seek to dominate the moment, only to hold it as it was, and in that presence there was no urgency, no need to push further, because the shift had already taken place, the balance had already been rewritten, and Richard understood that now. Not completely, but enough to feel the weight of it. Enough to recognize that the control he had relied on was not as absolute as he had believed, and for a brief second something passed across his expression, not anger, not defensiveness, but something quieter, something closer to recognition, and the room, still and attentive, seemed to register that change as well. The subtle acknowledgement that the moment was no longer about resistance, but about what came after it. While Naomi remained composed, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze steady, standing not above him, not below him, but exactly where she had been all along, in a place that required nothing more than being seen. The moment did not collapse into confrontation. It softened, not in weakness, but in clarity, and Naomi could feel the shift moving through the room like a quiet exhale, the kind that follows realization rather than resolution. And Richard Whitmore stood there for a second longer than expected, his posture still composed, but no longer rigid. The tension that had held his shoulders in place now easing just enough to reveal something more human beneath it. And when he finally moved, it was slower, more deliberate, his hand lifting slightly, not in command, not in dismissal, but in something closer to reconsideration, and the gesture paused halfway, suspended in the same space where her hand had once been left unanswered. And that symmetry did not go unnoticed, not by Naomi, not by the room, because it carried a quiet echo of what had already happened, and for a brief moment the entire evening seemed to fold back on itself, offering a chance to see the same action from a different place. And Richard's eyes met hers again, this time, without the distance he had maintained before, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, stripped of the performance that had defined it earlier. "I misread the situation," he said, and the words were simple, almost understated, but they landed with weight because they were not something he was accustomed to saying, and around them the room shifted again, not in tension, but in recognition, the kind that comes when something rare is spoken plainly. And Naomi did not react immediately. She let the words exist on their own, let them settle without rushing to accept or reject them, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, and she noticed the way the guards had adjusted once more, their stance no longer anticipatory, no longer reactive, but neutral, as if the moment had moved beyond escalation into something quieter, something that did not require intervention. And Naomi took a small step forward, not closing the distance entirely, but enough to meet him in that shared space of understanding. Her movements measured, her presence calm, and she looked at his hand for a fraction of a second, then back at his face, her expression unreadable, not cold, not warm, simply present. And when she spoke, her voice carried the same quiet clarity as before. "It was never about the situation," she said, and the distinction settled between them, subtle but precise, and Richard's hand lowered slightly, not withdrawn, not fully extended, just suspended in that space of reconsideration. And for the first time that evening, there was no immediate response, no attempt to fill the silence, because the moment did not need to be resolved in the way he was used to. It only needed to be understood, and around them the guests began to shift again, not returning to their conversations yet, but adjusting their stance, their attention, as if the room itself had moved into a new phase, one where observation gave way to quiet acknowledgement, and Naomi remained steady, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze level, and she did not reach for his hand, not out of refusal, not out of defiance, but because the gesture itself no longer held the same meaning, and in that choice there was no need for explanation, no need for emphasis, just a quiet assertion of something deeper than the moment itself. While the light from the chandeliers reflected softly against the marble floor, and in that reflection, the space between them looked different now, not divided, not bridged, but understood in a way that could not be undone. The room did not return to what it had been. It could not. Something had shifted too deeply for that, and Naomi stood in the same place, not holding the moment, not extending it, just allowing it to settle into what it had become, while Richard Whitmore slowly lowered his hand the rest of the way, not in defeat, not in embarrassment, but in acceptance of something he could no longer ignore, and the gesture, small and controlled, carried more meaning than any apologies spoken aloud. And for a second he looked at his own hand, as if recognizing it for the first time that evening. the same hand that had dismissed her now resting quietly at his side, no longer elevated, no longer separate. And when his gaze returned to Naomi, it held something different, not authority, not even uncertainty, but awareness, the kind that does not arrive easily and does not leave once it has settled in. And he gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, not to signal agreement, not to close the moment, but to acknowledge it, to mark the point where something inside him had shifted. And Naomi saw it, not as a victory, not as validation, but as a change, and she responded with nothing more than stillness, her posture steady, her presence unchanged, because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to say that had not already been understood. And around them the room began to move again, slowly at first. A glass lifted, a chair adjusted. A quiet conversation resumed in hushed tones, but the energy was different now, softer, more aware, as if everyone present had witnessed something they would not easily forget. And the guards returned to their positions, not reverting to what they had been, but carrying forward the adjustment that had taken place, their stance more measured, their attention more balanced, no longer orbiting a single figure. And Naomi turned slightly toward the window once more, the city lights stretching out beyond the glass, steady and distant. And for a moment she simply stood there, her reflection beside her, calm and clear, before she reached up and straightened her badge, the small motion precise, deliberate. A quiet return to the role she had been seen in at the start of the evening. And yet it did not feel the same, because now the room had seen beyond it, and that could not be undone. And behind her Richard remained where he was, not moving immediately, his gaze lingering on the space she occupied, not out of confusion anymore, but out of recognition. And then he turned, slowly, rejoining the room in a different way than before, not reclaiming it, but existing within it. And Naomi took a step forward, her shoes making a soft, almost inaudible contact with the marble, and began to move along the edge of the room again, her presence quiet, her movements precise, but the air around her felt warmer now, not because anything had changed in the environment, but because something had changed in how she was seen. And as she passed by the same table she had adjusted earlier, she paused for just a fraction of a second, aligning a glass that had shifted slightly out of place, the simple act, grounding the moment back into something tangible. And then she continued, her reflection gliding beside her, steady and unbroken, while the room carried on, altered in a way no one could fully describe, but everyone could feel. And in that quiet continuation, the meaning of what had happened remained, not in words, not in gestures, but in the space itself, held there like a memory that would not fade. The evening resumed, but not as it had begun, the rhythm returning in fragments, softer, more deliberate, as if every movement now carried an awareness that had not existed before. And Naomi continued along the edge of the room, her steps measured, her presence quiet, blending once again into the flow of the event without forcing it. Yet nothing about her felt invisible anymore, not to the guards, not to the guests, not even to the staff who moved past her with a slightly different kind of acknowledgement, subtle but real. A glance held a fraction longer, a nod given without hesitation, and she did not react to it. She did not seek it. She simply continued, adjusting a misplaced napkin, aligning a chair that had drifted from its position, the small, precise actions grounding the space in a way that felt steady and intentional. While behind her Richard Whitmore moved through the room differently. Now, not slower, not uncertain, but more aware, his interactions measured, his voice still composed but no longer carrying the same automatic weight. And when he greeted the next guest, his handshake lingered just a moment longer than before, not for effect, not for show, but as if the gesture itself had been reconsidered, recalibrated, and a few of the guests noticed, not consciously, but enough to feel the shift in tone, the subtle change in how presence was expressed rather than assumed. And near the entrance the guards maintained their positions, but their formation no longer revolved around a single axis, their attention distributed more evenly, their posture reflecting a balance that had not been there earlier. And Naomi passed by one of them, their eyes meeting briefly, not as strangers, not as roles, but as two people who understood the same moment from different angles. And he gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, and she returned it with the same quiet acknowledgement. Before continuing on, her reflection moving beside her in the glass, steady and clear, and as she reached the far end of the room, she paused for just a moment, looking out over the city lights beyond the window, the distant movement of cars tracing thin lines through the night, a reminder that outside this room, the world continued without pause, without awareness of what had shifted inside, and she took a slow breath, not heavy, not relieved, just present, letting the stillness settle before, turning back toward the room, and as she did, she noticed the space differently now, not as something divided between power and presence, but as something shared, something more fluid, where visibility was no longer dictated by assumption alone, and she stepped forward again, re-entering the flow of the evening, her movements precise, her posture relaxed, carrying with her the same quiet certainty that had never changed, only been recognized, and across the room Richard's gaze found her once more, not lingering, not searching, just acknowledging, a brief connection that did not demand anything further, and he gave a small nod, not as a conclusion, not as a resolution, but as a continuation of something that had begun, and Naomi did not respond with a gesture. She simply continued walking, her presence steady, her reflection unbroken, while the room carried on around her, altered in a way that could not be reversed, held together now not just by design or status, but by the quiet understanding that respect, once seen clearly, could not be unseen. By the time the evening began to thin into its final hour, the room no longer felt like a stage. It felt like a place where something had been quietly corrected, not erased, not rewritten with force, but adjusted in a way that would linger long after the last guest had left, and Naomi Carter moved through it with the same steady rhythm she had carried from the beginning, her presence unchanged, her steps measured, her attention grounded in the small details that held everything together. A glass placed just right, a chair aligned with the table, a folded napkin smoothed with care, actions that seemed simple, almost invisible, yet now carried a different kind of recognition, not from applause, not from acknowledgement spoken aloud, but from the absence of dismissal, the quiet space where she was no longer overlooked, and near the center of the room Richard Whitmore stood in conversation once more, his voice calm, his posture composed, but there was a subtle shift in the way he occupied the space, less rigid, less absolute, as if the edges of his authority had softened into something more aware, and when a guest extended a hand to him, he met it fully, without hesitation, without pause, the gesture complete, unguarded, and it passed without comment. But it did not pass unnoticed, and across the room Naomi saw it, not as a correction made for her, not as a response to the moment they had shared, but as a continuation of something that had begun within him, something quieter, deeper, and she turned slightly toward the window one last time, the city lights stretching out beyond the glass like a map of countless unseen moments unfolding all at once, and for a second she simply stood there, her reflection beside her, calm and steady, before reaching up and removing her badge, the small clip releasing with a soft, almost inaudible sound, and she held it in her hand, not as a symbol, not as proof, but as something temporary, something that had served its purpose for the night, and she slipped it into her pocket, her fingers resting there for just a moment before falling back to her side. And without announcement, without drawing attention, she turned and began to walk toward the exit, her steps quiet against the marble, her presence moving once again along the edge of the room, not leaving behind an absence, but a shift that would remain. And as she passed by the guards, each one acknowledged her with the slightest change in posture, a subtle straightening, a quiet recognition that did not require words, and she returned it with the same calm steadiness she had carried all evening. And near the doorway she paused for just a fraction of a second, not to look back, not to hold on to the moment, but simply to exist within it one last time. The soft hum of the room behind her, the distant sounds of the city ahead, and then she stepped forward, crossing the threshold without hesitation, without ceremony, and the doors closed gently behind her, sealing the warmth of the ballroom inside while the cool night air met her skin, and inside, the evening continued, quieter now, more aware, the conversation softer, the gestures more deliberate, and though no one spoke of what had happened, it remained, held in the space between movements, in the way eyes met and hands were offered, in the subtle understanding that something had shifted not because it was forced, but because it was finally seen. And outside, Naomi walked into the night without looking back, her reflection no longer framed by glass but carried within her, steady and unbroken. As the city moved around her, unchanged, and yet, in one quiet room behind her, something human had been remembered.